He's not little Marco anymore. For those of you who might remember the 2016 campaign, I certainly do. You might recall that was the insult hurled by then candidate Donald Trump in the direction of then sitting Florida Senator Marco Rubio, little Marco. You might also recall, and the internet has preserved all this if you're really curious, a lot of jousting back and forth, questioning each other's manhood. It really happened, ladies and gentlemen, in full public view. Why does all of this matter today? Well, because President Trump removed his national security advisor, Mike Waltz. And that's the fifth national security advisor President Trump has had in 4 years and 102 days in office. Much of that was about the Signal chat, the leak, all that started by Mike Waltz. He's now been nominated to be the next UN ambassador. Who's going to replace him on an interim basis? Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, giving him, that is to say Marco Rubio, not just one, but 4 jobs. What are they? Secretary of State, Interim National Security Advisor, U.S. Archivist, and leader of USAID. 4 jobs, 1 person, all within the Trump administration. There's no more little Marco. I want to start tonight with Jennifer Jacobs at the White House. Jennifer, it's been a very busy day over there. You were at the forefront of some of this reporting today. Tell us what you know, what you've learned.
You're right, Major. It has been an evolving story throughout the day. There has just been one departure from the National Security Council, and that is going to be National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. Some inside the White House are characterizing it as almost a promotion that he's being nominated for ambassador to the United Nations. But what I can tell you is Alex Wong, there were discussions this morning that one of Waltz's deputies, Alex Wong, might be asked to leave as well. His situation remains unclear. This morning, I know he was still carrying on national security business. He was talking policy with some of his coworkers. So for now, there is just going to be one departure, and that's Mike Waltz. And why is Mike Waltz moving out of this role? We were told it's accumulation of effects. There were some concerns that perhaps he hadn't vetted the people on the National Security Council closely enough to make sure that they were super aligned with President Trump's agenda. It was the Signal situation and how Mike Waltz kind of clumsily added a journalist to a very sensitive email text chain, a text chain on the Signal app. And it was also partly because I was told Waltz is viewed as just perhaps not quite the best fit in the West Wing amongst the president's advisors. So it was accumulation of things, Major.
And for those in the White House who are describing this as a promotion, that's going to be a very tough sell. Because as you know, Jennifer, the National Security Advisor sits at the West Wing hub of everyone on the national security team, Pentagon, CIA, Director of National Intelligence, State Department, and is the organizer of all that flow of information for the President of the United States. As central a person as can be created within the West Wing. And to be moved to the United Nations under an administration that, let's be honest, takes a somewhat dim view of international diplomacy through the United Nations, let alone the world-based rules order post-World War II, that has to feel like something slightly less than a promotion.
That's right. Until today, or the last few hours, the president wasn't really focused on who he was going to choose to replace Elise Stefanik as his nominee for the United Nations. This all came about at the last minute. It was a very last-minute decision for the president to decide, well, we're going to slide Mike Waltz into the UN ambassador nomination. But I can tell you, it was not an unfriendly event. In the first term, people were dismissed with a harsh tweet. Senior advisors noted to me today that Mike Waltz was not escorted out of the building. People still respect him and think he's a good man. This was considered a quote-unquote soft landing.
Jennifer Jacobs with the White House. Thank you so very much. Sumi Somaskanda joins me now. She is chief presenter, and that's a great word. The Brits have so many great words. That is a great word. And our partners at BBC News. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. Your impression on this very hectic day in the national security realm of the Trump administration.
Yeah, an extraordinary day to see Mike Waltz, on Fox and Friends early in the morning. Still national security advisor. Right. Then towards the end of the day, as Jennifer was just saying, now apparently going to be the ambassador to the United Nations.
We were all chasing reporting about his eventual ouster like minutes after he stopped that Fox News hit this morning.
Indeed. And there was speculation. And, you know, we have to say, leaning into some of the points that Jennifer made there was speculation for some time about this ever since Signalgate. And I'd lean into something else that Jennifer said as well on him not being, quote unquote, the best fit for this administration. You know, when news came out after Donald Trump was elected in November that Mike Waltz would be named for this post, National Security Advisor, there wasn't the same pushback as there was for other cabinet positions, particularly among Democrats and some of Donald Trump's critics, because he was someone who was seen as representing more of those traditional Republican priorities, national security priorities, foreign policy. You know, we had then Representative Mike Waltz on our program to talk about Iran, China, Russia, you know, typical foreign policy, big meaty foreign policy issues. And he was seen as someone who was a bit of a partner, particularly on the war, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And apparently that was one of the irritants, Major, is the fact that he was persistent on this understanding or this need to punish Russia, to take a tough line with Russia. And that wasn't necessarily in line with what we've seen from other members of Donald Trump's cabinet.
And the national security staff has been under something of a low-level assault, if not full-blown assault, from an outside Trump advisor.
Laura Loomer.
Laura Loomer.
Yeah.
Who has many positions that are regarded as questionable, if not lacking absolute foundation. 9/11 being an inside job is something she used to peddle. Having this outsized influence not only on the staff, but now, it appears, might have framed some of President Trump's thinking about Mike Waltz.
Yeah, that appears to be the case, definitely. And remember, it was just early April that we saw Laura Loomer go to the White House and demand the resignation or the firing of members of the National Security Council who she deemed were not loyal enough to President Trump. Now, we understand from some of the reporting that came out at that time that Laura Loomer came into the White House and Mike Waltz did try to defend some of those members of the National Security Council. Interesting, Alex Wong, who we saw Jennifer mention there, he was actually just on one of our BBC flagship programs last night talking to one of our anchors, and he was pressed about Signalgate and the controversy. He deflected and talked about the fact that this chat was about punishing the Houthis, about free navigation in the Red Sea. And he was asked at the end of the interview, would you come back in 100 days to talk about the administration's achievements? And he said, we'll see. There'll be many more achievements. It gives you a sense of just how much turmoil there was even just this morning at the White House.
And as we sit here, unscathed, at least for the moment, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who was even more visible in sharing information in that particular signal chat that got Mike Waltz into hot water, then in a separate one. And now there's reporting of a third one. Yeah. And he, right now, appears to be safe.
And that second one, we should say, with his family members, his wife and his brother, and it is understood
personal attorney.
Exactly. And it's understood that much of that information was similar to that first signal chat.
Highly sensitive, if not classified. Highly sensitive, the kind of thing that if you are a rank-and-file member of the military or the intel community and you do the same thing, you're in immediate hot water.
And that is why you are seeing some Democrats say here, look, it should not have been Mike Waltz. It should have been Pete Hegseth. But at the same time, we're hearing, and as Jennifer was indicating, they're reporting that at this point, it looks like Pete Hegseth, is safe in his position as defense secretary, even as just earlier this week we saw the news that a drone attack by the Houthis caused the U.S. to lose a $60 million jet off the back of a plane. So certainly he has faced some challenges in that role. But as of now, as we understand, Donald Trump is standing behind Pete Hegseth.
And Sumi, you mentioned this, and it was important that you did so, that Mike Waltz was on Fox this morning.
Yes.
When he was there, he was talking about the mineral deal negotiated and signed last night by Ukraine and the Trump administration. Yeah. Evaluate that for our audience.
So this mineral deal, the Treasury Department is saying this is a very important agreement for both the Ukrainians and the U.S. And what's interesting here is this is not just about critical minerals. It's also about oil and gas. So essentially the U.S. and Ukraine get 50-50 on the royalties from Ukraine's resources. So again, oil, gas, and critical minerals. And the idea that the U.S. has made here, or the Trump administration, the idea that they've sold here is that with an economic interest in Ukraine, with U.S. economic interests represented in Ukraine, that will serve as a deterrent to Russia and Vladimir Putin. I'll tell you, Major, we've spoken to some Ukrainians. A member of parliament, a former defense minister today said that's not a security guarantee. That will not prevent Russia from attacking again. So we'll have to see what the next steps are for Ukraine, but it's seen as an important first step.
The Ukrainians would have preferred something in writing about a security guarantee. The Trump administration says, well, that's implied because if our economic interests are there, Don't you think we're going to defend them, or a future administration would defend them? The Ukrainians would prefer to see something in writing.
They would, and, to be fair, the administration has said any sort of actual security guarantee backed by troops on the ground would have to be taken on by the Europeans. That is something that the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said that the coalition of the willing that he's built around support for Ukraine could possibly take on in the future. You could possibly see, your European presence in Ukraine. And that's something that the National Security Advisor, now former, as we understand, Mike Waltz, had been very clear on. He said, the Europeans need to take on more responsibility for security in Ukraine. So that could still be a possibility going forward, in cooperation, however, with the U.S.
The Britishism is presenter. It's a perfect word, far better than the American word anchor. Sumi Somaskanda, BBC, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Charlie Daggett joins me now from the Pentagon. Charlie, what we've just been talking about flows through your building. Take us away.
Well, they've been waiting for the axe to fall for weeks, ever since Signalgate, or the Signal conversation, broke out. And as you had mentioned there are a lot of people, especially on the Hill, who said, look, you picked the wrong guy. That the true culprit here is not Waltz, who set up the channel and inadvertently invited a journalist to be part of that conversation, but Hegseth himself, who shared, as you put it, I think correctly so, sensitive, if not outright classified information. But this may have granted Hegseth some breathing room, because the argument being that you don't want to have a sort of 1-2. The Trump administration is losing somebody who's been critical to multiple foreign policy challenges that the United States is facing at the moment. Some of those military challenges, Ukraine, Iran, the conflict in Gaza, China over the horizon. So might not be the best time to lose two important figures as they're dealing with not just foreign policy issues, but military issues.
And Charlie, if I could, Sumi made a mention of this, the ongoing campaign against the Houthis, their response, and where things sort of are right now. And I know that this is something you've been pressing for in that building. But the lack of sort of visibility from the defense secretary or those speaking on his behalf about what's going on day to day or week to week in that confrontation with the Houthis.
Yeah, Major, I pointed out to a few officials that I spoke to today, because we're getting these numbers, but they're vague. Ironically, they say it's down to operational security, that they don't want to share the information about the conflict with the Houthis. But if you recall, and I was there covering the conflict against ISIS, we were getting detailed daily reports from CENTCOM as far as their targeting, the number of strikes, and what they were carrying out. Still have to point out, because you and I have discussed this, we have two carrier strike groups, two. It's about as high profile as you can possibly get in that region, who are currently taking part in that fight against the Houthis. You got the USS Harry S. Truman and the Carl Vinson, with a number of destroyers. And those destroyers, by the way, would be responsible for the protection of the Truman. So if it is to be believed that the Truman was taking evasive maneuvers because it was being targeted by the Houthis, that suggests either collapse in intelligence or surveillance or interception, because they should have seen it coming, as it were. So this is a daily battle. It has been happening. Operation Rough Rider is even a name to it. It's been happening since about that Signalgate story popped out a few weeks before that. And this is a real shooting war. We talk about the wars in Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine, and we talk about the potential conflict with Iran, in Gaza. There is one conflict that the United States is engaged in on a daily basis with F-18 fighter jets, F-35 fighter jets, cruise missiles, destroyers, multiple strikes throughout the day, in what's been called by the defense secretary a relentless campaign in a kinetic shooting war against the Houthis.
And Charlie, you're deeply experienced in Ukraine. Evaluate how the Pentagon views this minerals deal and the idea that it implies, though doesn't state specifically, security interests of the U.S. on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, Major, I think it's really important to point out that this minerals deal, if you want to even call it that, is not a peace deal. There are no security guarantees. And President Zelensky, in the original deal, he had been pushing for that. It's a joint investment fund. It's sort of peace adjacent. But the secretary said, it shows the U.S. is committed to facilitate the end of this cruel and senseless war. But officials here at the Pentagon have said, look, what does this mean in practical terms? They don't see it having an impact on the supply of weapons. In the future, military aid could be part of that deal to offset the resources, but it is status quo ante.
Charlie Daggett at the Pentagon. Always a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.